Mike is really well known to all of you. He's the CEO of ANZ Bank, and I must say, if you had been here earlier in the day, Mike, you would have heard how pleased we were and how much response we've been given to the sponsorship that ANZ has and support that ANZ has given to the session and to this whole conference, in fact. Well, Mike came to Australia from HSBC, one of the world's, in fact, I suspect the world's largest bank, but I'll get a nod if that's correct or a kick if it's wrong, from Hong Kong. And there he had, my recollection is, running one of 3 divisions, but the division was the most profitable. I think probably produced all of the profit for HSBC, or a very good share of it, before he came to Australia. He's come to Australia and running the ANZ Bank, and has quite clearly, quite uniquely, focused once again back on the opportunities in Australia. And he's pursued that with a passion. And I think if anybody's got the passion to take on that sort of corporate commitment, it certainly has to be innovative, and that's what he's going to talk about to us. Mike, thank you very much for being with us. Thanks.
Many thanks. Is that working? Yeah. Many thanks, Hugh, and it's a great privilege to be here this afternoon. As you heard, my name is Mike Smith. I'm the Chief Executive of ANZ, which is a big bank. And you're now probably thinking, big banks and innovation hardly seem good bedfellows. It's a bit like fat-free and ice cream, or military and intelligence. Or perhaps the best one is European and Union. But the reality is that the larger the company, the more it needs to innovate and to create, to survive, let alone prosper. And despite what you may have heard, that most small businesses don't last a year, i.e. generally fail in their first year, this is generally not true. The majority of small businesses actually survive for over 10 years. And that's about the same for companies of all sizes. Big companies, though, actually find it very difficult to cope with change. If we took the top 50 public listed Australian companies in 1980, 30 years ago, and look forward 10 years to 1990, there are only 16 around in 1990 from that 50. 30 years on, there are only 8 left of that original 50 right now. And I guess it wasn't that the chief executives of those businesses had a business plan which said, yeah, we'll go out of business in 10 years. Well, actually, as an aside, it's somewhat worrying. I noticed the other day that large companies around the world are firing their chief executives at a rate of 2 a week. And what's even worse, actually, is that chief executives in financial services are getting fired at double that rate. But to go back to the top 50 companies, 34 of them were taken over and 8 simply underperformed. In 1980, the 3rd largest company in Australia was a mining company. It was called Mount Isa Mines. By 2000, it had slipped to number 64, and soon after that it had disappeared altogether after being taken over. And I think this demonstrates that while the journey from a good company to a great company can take a long time, the journey for a good company to a mediocre one can actually happen very quickly. And of course, companies that are performing poorly can innovate and can bring themselves back from near-death experiences. And I think another great example we have in Australia. In 1980, Woolworths was the 38th largest company in Australia. And in 1990, it was doing so poorly that it didn't actually appear on the list of top 50 companies. But a succession of excellent chief executives backed by a very strong management team innovated in a sector that was actually just doing more of the same. And today, Woolworths is our 9th largest company. But unfortunately, the Woolworths story is not as common as we would like. So why do big companies fail? One of the reasons is that the world changes, and it changes very quickly. And that may explain why Sony, the same company that created mobility in music with the Walkman, didn't invent the iPod, although it had actually access to the same type of technology that Apple did. And it perhaps explains why Warner, Sony, and EMI handled the change from vinyl to audio tape and audio tape to CD pretty well, but they've really struggled with the move to the digital world. In banking, maybe it explains why the son of a Lebanese fruit shop owner who'd just come out of bankruptcy was able to borrow $100,000, rent a small office in Parramatta, and fundamentally change the mortgage market here in Australia. That man, of course, was John Simon. And maybe that's why, since 2007, over 280 banks have collapsed in the United States. Others around the world are on government life support, and there are only 11 AA-rated banks left in the world right now. 4 of them are Australian. Of course, ANZ is one. And maybe that's, I think, why some corporate giants are in danger of turning to dinosaurs. How could BP, one of the world's most admired and successful companies, see nearly 40% or $49 billion wiped off its market value in just 5 months? These are humbling times for chief executives. And I believe the problem all of us in large organizations are facing is really a lack of innovation. And by innovation, I mean the introduction of something for the first time. And I know that when you hear me say innovation, you immediately think of the iPad or the hybrid car or the greatest breakthrough of our time, the internet refrigerator. Yeah? Any of you got one of those? But in large companies, what's more important than new products is innovation in thinking. Most companies spend time thinking about how to play the game better than the competition or how to get to best practice. Their key assumption is that the secret to superior value creation lies in extracting inefficiency from the existing value chain. It means that actually many strategic plans are simply medium-term operating plans. But what we need to be thinking about is not how do we play the game better, but how do we change the game itself. As someone who's run large businesses around the world, I know that it's very hard to bring innovation into the thinking of a company. Many corporate change programs are simply an excuse for executive entertainment, something that enables everybody involved, staff and managers to say that, yeah, we've been on the change program, so we must have changed. But our beliefs are like the bars of a cage. They stop us really thinking differently, and we have to be able to do that. Despite the fact that China's GDP growth has averaged over 8% year on year for over 20 years, and by the turn of the century it was one of the largest economies in the world, 3 years ago, when I announced ANZ's ambition was to be a leading super-regional bank in the Asia-Pacific region, our shares were marked down. The conventional thinking was that Australian companies failed outside Australia, that Asia was just an emerging market, that its people didn't have a great deal of wealth, and that moving into Asia was a serious risk. It's worth reflecting, though, that the bigger picture of what has happened in Asia isn't new. For 18 centuries prior to the Industrial Revolution, China was the largest economy in the world. Today, it's the world's second largest economy, with more millionaires, more megacities, more internet users, and more skyscrapers than any other country on earth. But China's emergence over the past 30 years as an economic powerhouse owes as much to the Chinese government's process of innovation through reform and opening and the creation of a new class of entrepreneurs as it does to the sheer size of its population. And of course, the Asian story is not just a China or even an India story. South Korea has used innovation to move from an economic backwater to become a dominant force in steel and shipbuilding, and more recently in electronic goods, machine tools, cars for emerging market countries. And over time, policy innovation is also seen assisting the growth of Vietnam and Indonesia. Nor is the Asia story just about emerging markets. Singapore and Hong Kong were recently ranked first and second in the Lausanne Institute for Management Development's annual ranking of the world's most competitive countries, overtaking for the first time the US, which slipped to number 3. And what I want to highlight is that while the sustained growth of Asia and indeed other emerging markets may not be the only major disruption reshaping the global economy in the next 10 years, it may well be the most profound. And Australia needs innovation in its thinking about the region if it's to succeed and prosper. Behind Asia's growth today are 2 socioeconomic shifts, the same 2 that powered economic growth in the West over the past 2 centuries. The first is a demographic shift involving labour force growth and declining birth rates, or more people in employment with smaller families and more disposable income. The second is the largest urban migration in history, in which it's underway, with nearly 1.5 million people around the world moving to cities every week. In 10 years' time, China will have 15 cities, each with more people than live in Australia, and a further 22 cities with a population of more than 10 million people each. This is unleashing huge productivity gains as people move from rural to urban jobs and turn their countries into manufacturing and service powerhouses. In the next decade, economies in Asia are going to rapidly evolve from the current role as a supplier of low-cost goods and services to become significant suppliers of capital, talent, and innovation. Of course, the market here in Australia is now opening its eyes to this shift, and I like to think that ANZ has helped put some of the runs on the board. We're one of the fastest growing banks in Asia, the 4th largest international bank in the region, and we have access recently to over $10 billion in Asian savings to support our global funding task. And our share price, for the first time since we set out our aspiration at the end of 2007, is now outperforming our peers. But the point is that our critics in 2007 now see not the risks of a strategy which engages with Asia, but the risks of having a strategy that doesn't engage with Asia. Of course, in business, while innovation in thinking might be difficult, I read a quote recently which went along the lines of, "Ideas are 2 a penny, but perfection is in their execution." I think despite the blindingly obvious staring us in the face sometimes, it's also very difficult to mobilize ourselves around new ideas. You know the saying that, that points to our thinking that it's not going to change? For years before the global financial crisis, we heard people say, This time it's different. Technology has changed everything. Debt is good. And all that despite the fact that for 600 years the cycle of boom and bust has been the same. In large organizations, we have a tendency, I think, to move the deck chairs rather than to fundamentally innovate. Most companies stick to a model of relatively autonomous business units, or to use the technical term, silos. Silos stifle innovation and create, I think, that most popular of business contests, the turf war. But we're at a time where the world, and not only the business world, actually needs new thinking. Today, what is going to make the difference is not the strategic planning system or even the strategic planning department, but the intellectual strength and capacity for innovative thinking amongst our top leaders. These are the people whose responsibility it is to think longer term and to sense the new game. The ability to see and communicate the burning opportunity as well as the burning platform. In other words, they will have the strategic credibility to lead an organization or a nation in a new and uncharted direction. This requires fundamentally different abilities from those linked to short or medium-term operating plans. It requires a move from improving the process to a process of discovery. The capacity to create new business and industry models, to build new organizational structures and capabilities that respond to tomorrow's environment. I might add here that it also takes a lot of courage to give customers and staff a voice. And as importantly, to actually respond to them. It isn't easy to listen to activists who are telling us, or telling you something about the future and the impact it may have on your company, particularly if you don't want to hear that message. This idea of needing courage to innovate and courage to collaborate is not new. The convenient myth is that only small companies or small organizations inside companies can create innovations. The other myth is that only innovative companies in cutting-edge industries can really innovate. But again, looking back to those who survived in Australia, if you look at our stock exchange since 1901, there are companies that have survived, like the Australian Gaslight Company, the Colonial Sugar Refining Company, the Broken Hill Proprietary Company, companies that have reinvented themselves. So what does an organization need to create the environment and the leaders who can successfully innovate? First, you need a shared mindset. Leaders across the organization have to have deeply held common views about the ambition and the direction of the organization as a whole. Second, a shared logic. Widely agreed assumptions about the nature of cross-divisional opportunities and the ability and the courage to look at and create new advantages rather than defending the old ones or the existing ones. Then you need shared discipline, how to collaborate and without losing business focus, how to create new knowledge across the organization, not just sharing existing knowledge. And finally, a shared language for this across the organization as a whole. As you walk away from this conference, remember the ability and the need to innovate is not just limited to people like Steve Jobs at Apple. We all need to innovate. In fact, with the movements in the world's economic tectonic plates linked to the rise of Asia, there has never been a time where innovation is more necessary. There are enormous opportunities opening up today. Innovation is the only answer to taking advantage of them and to surviving and to thriving in a world of constant change. Many thanks for listening to me today. Thank you.